why don't we move on to something you convinced us to do, which is to watch the movie from 1987, The Brave Little Toaster. I'd love to hear what made you choose this movie. It was on the heels of me choosing an animated
Yeah.
from my childhood, that was only from a few years before 1982, but it's interesting
Yeah.
noticing the differences. Yeah, talk a little bit about Brave Little Toaster and why you picked it.
Brave Little Toaster was a weird thing because it was on like it's like Disney adjacent. It was like Disney's video sort of releases.
Like Disney
Um,
helped fund the making of it, but it didn't
yes,
get made
yes.
with their production imprint.
They
It
didn't
was sort of
claim
like
it
a,
for a while.
but and it was kind of like it
Yeah,
was
yeah,
not made in house at Disney, and it was
right.
always kind of shunted off to the side. And I think there was a
Yeah,
time where it was going to be the first CGI movie that Disney, like John Lasseter, was supposed to be involved, and then
right,
it got
right.
shelved, and then got made the way it got made. But what's interesting is then when John Lasseter made Toy Story, he clearly still had a lot of ideas from this movie on his mind.
Clearly. And that's kind of what I was getting at. I didn't mean to like I'm not slandering Toy Story. I'm just saying like this is the bones of that story for sure. And it's really cool that if somebody's like, man, I've never seen a movie like this. A movie's never, you're like, well, I have a movie that came out decades beforehand that kind of has the bones of this story, not quite as
Well, a
squishy.
decade, maybe a decade.
Yeah.
When did Toy Story come out? 90, 94, 95.
Five. Yeah.
Oh,
Okay,
Jesus, it was
so this
94.
so this is
It
a
was
full
really
eight.
94.
This is a full 8 years before that. Still, though.
Yeah, I feel like it was 95,
Jesus Christ.
right? Yeah, it was something
Oh,
like that.
wow. So no, not 10 years. This 8. I mean, it makes it even weirder. But yeah, it's a cool movie. Not quite as fun. I'm gonna say that off top. It's not quite, but the music is very fun, man. Like the musicality of it is something I really thought that like added something to it. Just when I was like, man, that is one of the saddest scenes I've ever seen. An uplifting song comes in and kind of swoops in and makes me feel good. But yeah, I've loved that movie forever. I kind of feel like the Brave Little Toaster. I feel like we all kind of have felt like that. Like we come into a world where like it's unknown. We're very small, and you feel small at first, but then as you find your bones, you kind of figure things out. Like you could get through anything. And I always felt like the Brave Little Toaster. I was like the Brave Little Toaster, but with Blanky's personality.
So let's talk about some of what these characters are. This
Yeah.
is, and the reason why it's so much like Toy Story is because it's what happens to the objects, the appliances, the things you use when you're not around. And
Yes.
we start this movie in a cabin that seems like it's been abandoned for 5 years, but it seems like it's not that far of a drive, and the family likes it. So I don't know why they aren't using the cabin. But
Right.
inside the cabin, there's a vacuum cleaner, a lamp, a toaster, an electric blanket, and a radio that are all sort of anthropomorphized and talking to each other. And it's a little bit like Andy from Toy Story in that they are missing their owner, but they keep calling them the master, which is very strange.
Very strange. Yeah.
And it's a little culty, but it's, and I guess it's missing that element in Toy Story. It always felt like we were commenting on the notion that Woody is a little too into Andy. This movie doesn't really get into that idea. It's mostly just sort of presented unironically that they love their owner because they got used. Even though it's weird that they talk like they got played with, but it's like the vacuum cleaner and the lamp got played with,
Yeah.
the toaster
Yeah.
got played with. It's a little fuzzy, but it's still it's that same concept of Toy Story, is that like when someone shows up or turns and looks, they have to act normal, but then the
Yeah.
rest of the time they can. In fact, they worked out like a mobile battery situation for their adventure
did.
that is
Which is
very
very
sophisticated.
smart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like how the cable, particularly the vacuum cleaner Kirby, his electrical cable could be extended to be like 100 feet long if needed.
Yes.
Or
Wh-
it's like a few inches long.
How did you feel about the murder suicide that the air conditioner was attempting to do in the house for no reason? He's just like, I can't take this shit. Murder suicide. We're all gonna go. I'm gonna kill myself. You'll die with me.
The air conditioner with the voice of Jack Nicholson as performed by Phil Hartman,
Right.
which makes it even stranger.
Which is so the choices that they make in some of these scenes are just too adult. Sometimes I feel like, could I show this to my daughter? You know, when she gets to a point where she could watch it, and I don't know if I could like show it to her like 4, maybe like 7.
I feel like 7 or 8 would be about the right age, but if they're
yeah.
sophisticated, maybe even younger than that. Because I feel like if you get too old, this movie is going to fall prey to the same thing you experienced with The Last Unicorn, Ron, which is like it's going to feel too slow. It's going to feel too of another time. It's going to feel the pace is going to feel a little herky-jerky. Like this is a movie that moves pretty fast, but somehow still does feel a little long at 90 minutes.
Yeah.
And I think the musical moments, for me, always felt like, oh yeah, this is like a punctual, like one of those music. You're watching an animated movie and it gets to another song and you go, okay, I can tell we've got this much more movie left. But no, I do think that would be the main thing, and it's like I don't know what it is. I can't really put my finger on it. What it is about older movies, that the pacing, the way they move from scene to scene, the performing, it's just different, and it's like it's hard to picture a younger audience unless like I said, you play it for them when they're so young that their tastes aren't formed yet. It's hard to picture them not thinking this just feels old. Even if it didn't look a little old, you know what I mean? I can't quite say what I'm trying to say.
One of the things that makes it feel old is like sitcom transitions. So like this is very common in old movies, especially The Last Unicorn in this one. Like somebody will say something like, and then he took all my money. And then it'll sit on that moment and it'll transition, like fade to the next scene, which is like an applause break, legitimately an applause break that is built into a cartoon. That was like, I guess it was, this was like when older sort of producers were making stuff. They're like, yeah, that applause break right there, because they're gonna laugh at this joke. This is gonna be funny. And it just kind of sits there for longer than it should. And then it kind of that slow fades into the next scene. There's like 10 of those in this movie. And that's one of the things that I really did. I don't remember even seeing in the last like 10 years or so.
I think
maybe even more.
Like that kind of ending a scene and kind of fading out, but not necessarily ending a scene, ending a moment wherever the scene ends. And so that it's as though the characters then freeze and then it slowly fades to another scene. And I think, you're right. Both movies have like then a little musical interlude sometimes. Yeah. Before it gets back to the characters. I did think that like, it was fun hearing, like I think John Lovitz and Phil Hartman both in this were before, I think they recorded it around the time they were starting to do Saturday Night Live. So it's like, they were picked up because they went to the Groundlings, the sketch troupe, to like find voice performers for this, which is very smart because it does have, again, for 1987, it does feel like it's got some kind of like modern comic rhythms for that time. And I think I read that John Lovitz recorded all of his parts in one day because he had to go off. He was working on SNL. He was too busy. And so all of his stuff was done in one day, which is why, and this is why I looked it up, which is why if you notice, he doesn't sing his parts are not, it's a different voice, someone kind of doing a John Lovitz impression. And I noticed that it wasn't John Lovitz singing, and I looked that up, and it's because like they literally had him for one full day marathon session, to do all that stuff. So that's pretty crazy. I guess it kind of helps that his character is like disjointed from reality, so it doesn't matter if it doesn't quite sound like he's talking to the other characters. But anyway, well, I would say just another thing that, not to always compare it to The Last Unicorn, but I did have that in my mind when I watched this. I think it also represents, when you're watching it, you feel, even though this was funded by Disney and at times could have been a Disney thing, it's a different approach from The Last Unicorn, but it has that same feel of like, oh, this is somebody trying to make a good, nice looking animated movie, but it's not Disney. You're getting something that didn't go through all the Disney filters, and that might mean a certain amount of like quality control, but it also means a certain kind of homogenization of characters and themes and ideas. And there's a few jokes in this that might not have made it through if it were a Disney thing. I don't know what the climate like was at the time. But I don't know. I didn't know if you guys thought about that. Just the fact that, it's still, like nowadays, we've got a few different houses making animated movies that are on a certain level. But at the time, it was like anyone who wasn't Disney sort of was trying to establish themselves as some kind of an alternative to Disney. And this movie definitely feels like it's another attempt to like do something that does feel a little different than the, the Disney style.
Yeah, I think it definitely like I don't know. There was like a crop of those movies that came out in the 80s and early 90s that just, you know, could have been, should have been, would have been a Disney movie, you know, but what if for whatever reason weren't, or were just like a different animation house or whatever. But like a lot of them consistently, I feel like probably you could really tell that they were able to kind of be a little darker, you know, a
Yeah.
little less kind of like pleasant all the time, or you know, kind of certain kinds of jokes like you're saying, or like um that's probably the consist like that's the through line with those films that were outside of the Disney house, was that, you know, because of that quality control, or like that branding, that kind of control over what the messaging could be in the film, or even just the, you know, the kind of jokes or the kind of subject matter. And you kind of still see that in some ways. I mean, definitely in some of the Pixar movies, you know, they pushed that a little more. But um you know, this is one, you know, I think of that. I think of like Land Before Time, and even like Last Unicorn, like a lot of the bigger movies that came out in our, you know, relative childhood or teen years. Like there are ones that stand out as being, you know, well, those are definitely not Disney movies because the subject matter is a little darker, or it's like
Yeah.
not the best ending. You know, it kind of still ends on kind of a downer,
Mm-hmm.
even though it's a little more hopeful. Like even this movie ending, you know, the sacrifice he makes, you know, the idea that he's still being put back together, you know, is optimistic that he's able to, you know, restore him. But it's still kind of like
Yeah.
he still looks pretty rough, you know what I mean? Like it's not like riding off as like the best toaster on the market, you know what I mean?
Well, he
But
threw himself into the gears of like a car
right,
smasher machine
right,
to save his
Yeah.
friend. So I think
sure,
that
yeah.
to save the little boy who loved making toast in him.
Yeah.
Hey man, we all have our reasons, John. You know what I mean? Like
Hey man,
that's his function, and somebody
yeah,
was using him appropriately,
Yes.
yeah.
and that's all that mattered. You know what I mean? Like
We all want to be
Don't
used appropriately by the master.
Master. He kept saying it over and over again.
It's the master. The master comes. Did you notice they had little insults for each other too? I wrote down just a few of them.
Yes.
Dial face, slot head, and then also just this is a whole line. This is the kind of line that you get in a 1987 movie. Just period. Pipe down, carpet breath.
it's a good one. It's a
That's
good
like
one.
any writer for kids, you know, like that is like the kind that is it. That was the stuff they wrote for us.
That's
back
it.
then. Well, I was like, I would have been 14 or so when this came out. Yeah, 14. So I was I had aged out of. I still tried to see most animated movies because I was always kind of an animation nerd. But I never saw this one before this. So I was actually.
Wow.
I mean, I knew all
Wait,
about it.
what?
And I knew that it was like an animated movie that some people had carried forward, but I think if it had come out 2 years earlier, I definitely would have seen it. And if it had come out a few years later, I probably would have seen it because I was in both cases kind of either a kid or I was like a film buff who was like, oh, it's something new and animated, I'll go see it. But for whatever reason, it slipped through the cracks for me. I think it would have been one of those things when you're 14 or 15, if you don't see it within a couple of weeks of it coming out, you might not see it. And then I don't know if this was the kind of thing I would have rented when I was like dating and stuff in high school. So I just don't think it would have been on the radar. But it was interesting seeing it because I think I had a very similar journey to what you had with The Last Unicorn, Ronald, which is like I could definitely see the craft of it, but it was missing for me that magic of the childhood association, but which I know I would have had if I'd been the right age for this. It's like that was my jam, the idea of like what's happening in the house when you're not there and all the characters going on an adventure and the way that everyone kind of teams up, and you even had the sort of comic relief class clown kind of character of John Lovitz doing the radio, and I mean all that stuff. I know it would have been totally right down the middle for me, but because it wasn't, I was able to see it with a little bit more of a just an eye for the kind of the filmmaking of it. And I really did think, oh yeah, this is better than TV animation of the time, not as slick as like Don Bluth or Disney, and therefore it occupies that kind of special place for me of just of, you know, I love animated movies that are in that spot. I mean, as much as we've talked about Disney product on this show and as much as we love of it, there is something that kind of polishing that they do sort of takes the soul out of stuff just a little bit, or it makes it such a surefire thing that it squeezes out something rough that you get in something like this. And so, yeah, I think that like, and did you notice the pedigree of this? Joe Ranft, who is like one of the co-creators of this as a movie, he was a Pixar animator and writer, and also he did the voice of the repairman guy in this, or the guy who was like, I like how he didn't need to lie to customers and say he just got a shipment of stuff in, but he would like say, oh, I just got a shipment of blender motors in. Let me go back and get a blender motor for you, and then he would cold murder a blender.
Yes.
And then go out and put it in a box and say, oh, it's the last one we have in stock. I feel like he could be honest and say, I think I've got a blender with a motor. Let me go get it for you. Anyway, but that character was voiced by Joe Ranft, who also did the voice of the little penguin in the Toy Story movies. You know, Lenny, the penguin who's got the little rattly throat. So
that's really cool.
I recognized his voice, and I was like, can I be right about this? But I think that's something that the Pixar movies have done a lot of, is like use animators and directors for vocal
That's cool.
talent. So.
Two things bother me about that scene. The red marshmallows or pinkish marshmallows, which I've never seen in my life. And then like the way that he murders that blender, and he pulls the plug, and they just pull their plug into the carriage. Well, it's like, oh no, I don't want to. Yeah, it's just a dark sort of thing that keeps happening during the course of the movie.
Well, also, that blender's the only one that gets done that way, though. That blender's like the little shoes in Roger Rabbit that get dipped in the stuff. It's like, this is the one that really gets murdered, and there's no like cutting back to them, and you see that they're still moving or something like that. This is the cold-blooded murder.
It was pretty bad. And the kid was going to get murdered. The master was going to get murdered.
Yeah.
It had no limits in terms of like who the villain was going to attack. So I kind of love that about it. But yes, I could see why you would feel that way about this movie if you didn't experience it, really young.
But it also like Toy Story 3 is still borrowing from this movie with the trash compactors, or the trash burning scene, because not only is it like the danger of it, but in this movie I feel like it's maybe 2 or 3 times where the characters do that thing they do in Toy Story 3 of like, well, we're gonna die, like when they're all sinking in the mud. They each one kind of accept their fate as they go down, and it's like it's a little bit of that deep kind of stuff that we give Toy Story 3 credit for, which is having them accept their mortality for a second.
Of all the characters, it always makes me super teary for some reason. The blanket's like, I'm not scared.
I know.
Like, I'm like, what? Like, it is a heavy, like this, they called him a wimp. They called him a loser. Everybody's like, oh my God, I'm going to die. It's just like, I'm not scared. It fucks with me, man. It's like.
I made a note of that too, because it's like you would think that he would be saying, oh my God, I don't want to die. But instead he's like, yeah.
Yeah, whatever comes, son.
That's how it is out on these streets.
Yes. Sometimes you die in a pool of what was that?
Whatever that was. Yeah, I said mud, but it's basically bubbling stuff.
Yeah. But anyway, I love that movie. It's crazy how much I've watched it. I used to watch it constantly.
So what do you think about the fact that there's a scene where the toaster kills a flower by telling it the truth?
This is what I'm saying. Like,
it's like, no, I don't feel that way about you, flower. And he walks away, and the flower just goes meow, and loses a petal, and it's like the toaster just goes shit and walks away.
Yeah, man. It's a lot of weird stuff like that.
Well, the weirdest scene is the scene with the worm and the frogs and the fish, because I can't tell what's going on there. It seems like the fish is rescuing the worm from the bird so that he can eat it.
Yeah.
But then he lets it go. And so it's like, well, was this an altruistic fish all this time that just wanted to save the worm's life? I thought everybody wanted to eat the worm, and that was what was happening. But it turns out that the frogs and the fish are both like, hey, not our worm. If they don't want that hawk being the one to eat it,
Last thing about that scene, that happens, but they're also doing an iteration of the song that the appliances just did. How the fuck did they hear that song? They're not even in the same section, and it's almost like I was like, are they gonna die? Is that why? It was very strange to me. Anyway.
Did you think about any of that when you saw it as a kid, Ronald?
No.
And that's
No.
as it should be.
Well,
Yes,
that,
right.
that particular scene, no. But everything else, I kind of did think the blanket thing has forever made me cry for some
Yeah.
reason.
I'm
Like
not scared.
forever. I think it's something about like, that acceptance thing is just heavy, especially for like somebody you wouldn't expect. It's like, oh man, this is.
And you know what that is, right? That's him trying to give everybody else a sense of security because he's okay.
Oh my God.
That blanket.
Ugh.
He's
That's
a
that
little
secure
blanket.
little blanket.
Security
It's okay.
blanket.
It's okay, guys. It's gonna be
Oh
fine.
man.
And
That's
nobody
heavy.
would even snuggle with him the night before. Nobody would snuggle with him. Everybody said, fuck off.
Fuck him. Yeah.
Mm.
And it's even to the point where the lamp is like, I noticed you're being nice to him. And he's like, yeah. And he's like, why are you doing that?
Yeah.
Why are you being like? They called him a wimp.
Yeah. No, that was Kirby, the vacuum cleaner, who said
Kirby
that.
the vacuum cleaner.
And I guess as long as I'm being a nerd about the voices, you notice that that's the voice of the guy who sings "You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch," and he also is like Tony the Tiger from the Frosted Flakes commercials.
Oh,
Yeah.
get the-
Oh, you want to know what his name is? If you don't know,
Yes.
he's got the best name. Like this is like, if you were a voice actor from the early days of animation into the 80s, what name do you need? You need the name. Where is it? Thurl Ravenscroft. That's a fucking cool name.
He sounds like he should be in Harry Potter.
Thurl, Thurl,
The craziest name I've ever heard.
Ravenscroft. Yeah, it's like that sounds like the.
Oh, God.
You must have a castle somewhere if your name's Ravenscroft.
It's a house, yeah, in Game of Thrones.
Right.
Right.